The shadows in the governor's palace in Caesarea grew longer, casting dark shapes across the cold stone floor. Pontius Pilate sat alone, his eyes fixed on the bronze basin of water on the table before him. Years had passed since he stood on the judgment seat in Jerusalem, years since he surrendered a quiet, enigmatic Galilean preacher named Jesus to the clamor of the crowd. Yet the memory of that day remained etched into his soul. The former prefect of Judea was now consumed by paranoia. Every rustle of the wind sounded like the whispers of an angry mob. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of the man he had ordered to be crucified. Pilate rubbed his hands together, his skin raw from the obsessive washing that had become his daily ritual. He could still feel the phantom stain of water and blood, a physical manifestation of a guilt he could never escape. His authority was crumbling, his mind fracturing under the weight of his own decisions. In the year 36 of the Common Era, a new crisis erupted that would seal the governor's fate. A self-proclaimed prophet gathered a massive crowd of Samaritans at Mount Gerizim, promising to reveal sacred vessels hidden by Moses. The Samaritans, fueled by religious fervor, marched in great numbers. To the paranoid mind of Pontius Pilate, this was not a peaceful gathering of believers, but a rebellion waiting to ignite. Fearing a revolt that would reach Rome, Pilate acted with brutal force. He dispatched a heavily armed cavalry and infantry unit to intercept them. What followed was a horrific slaughter. The Roman legions cut through the crowd without mercy, killing hundreds of pilgrims and capturing the leaders, whom Pilate promptly ordered to be executed. The blood of the Samaritans soaked the dusty earth, and the cries of the survivors echoed throughout the province, sparking widespread outrage. The outcry reached the ears of Lucius Vitellius, the powerful governor of Syria and Pilate's direct superior. Vitellius, recognizing the danger of a provincial uprising caused by Pilate's extreme cruelty, decided to intervene. He traveled to Jerusalem to restore order. With a single devastating decree, the Syrian governor stripped Pontius Pilate of his power. The man who had ruled Judea with an iron fist for 10 years was suddenly reduced to nothing. Vitellius ordered Pilate to return to Rome immediately to face the judgment of the aging Emperor Tiberius. The news struck Pilate like a physical blow. The proud Roman official was now a disgraced exile, forced to prepare for a journey of utter humiliation. The power that had once protected him was gone, leaving him vulnerable to the cold, calculating gears of Roman justice. The voyage across the vast Mediterranean Sea was a torturous nightmare for the fallen prefect. Stripped of his grand robes, his bodyguards, and his dignity, Pilate spent the long days and sleepless nights pacing the deck of the merchant ship. As the ship sailed toward Rome, Pilate wrestled with a rising tide of terror. He knew the reputation of Emperor Tiberius, a ruler who had grown increasingly paranoid and unforgiving in his final years on the island of Capri. Pilate feared that his arrival in Rome would mean an immediate sentence of execution. This mounting terror fed into his already fragile mental health, causing him to experience terrifying visions. In the dead of night, he would wake up screaming, claiming to see the face of Jesus staring at him from the dark ocean waves. He would sit for hours, staring at his palms, desperately searching for a way to justify his past actions. After months of grueling travel, the ship finally docked at the bustling port of Ostia, just outside Rome. Pilate stepped onto the stone docks, his body trembling, prepared to face his doom. He expected to be met by imperial guards who would drag him to the chambers of Emperor Tiberius. However, as he entered the capital, he was met with the chaotic energy of a city in transition. The streets of Rome were filled with shouting crowds. Pilate soon learned the shocking truth that changed everything. Emperor Tiberius was dead. The long, oppressive reign of the old ruler had come to an end. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over Pilate. But his hope was instantly shattered when he discovered who had ascended to the imperial throne. The new ruler of Rome was none other than the young, unpredictable, and sadistic Caligula. Pontius Pilate was now at the absolute mercy of a ruler whose cruelty knew no bounds. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the disgraced prefect, as he prepared to stand before the golden throne of the new emperor. The grand marble halls of the imperial palace in Rome felt colder than the tombs of Judea. Pontius Pilate stood before the golden throne, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air was thick with the scent of expensive incense and the silent, in deadly tension of the court. On the throne sat the young emperor, Caligula. His eyes were wide, bright, and filled with a dangerous, unpredictable light that sent shivers down the spines of even his closest advisers. The young ruler looked down at the disgraced prefect, not with anger, but with a terrifying, playful amusement. Beside the throne stood men Pilate once called friends, senators and officials who had promised to support him. But as Pilate reached out his hands in a silent plea for help, they turned their heads away. They pretended not to know him, eager to distance themselves from a fallen man to win the favor of the new, volatile master of Rome. Pilate tried to speak, to justify his harsh actions against the Samaritans, to explain that he had only acted to protect the peace of the empire. But the words caught in his throat. Caligula did not care about the politics of a distant province, nor did he care about the laws of Rome. The young emperor began to laugh, a high, mocking sound that echoed off the high stone walls. The court quickly joined in, their forced laughter filling the room and crushing what little dignity Pilate had left. Caligula stepped down from his throne, circling the trembling former prefect like a predator. He whispered that a quick death on the executioner's block was far too simple, far too merciful for a man who had failed so spectacularly to keep order. Instead of ordering the sword, Caligula delivered a sentence of slow, agonizing torment. He declared that Pontius Pilate was stripped of all his wealth, his estates, and his status as a Roman citizen. Every ounce of his achievements was wiped clean from the imperial records. He was sentenced to perpetual exile, ordered to spend the rest of his miserable days in the remote, desolate wilderness of Gaul, in the territory known today as France. It was a region of endless forests, freezing winds, and biting cold, a place far removed from the sun-drenched hills of Judea. The former ruler of Jerusalem was to be cast out into the wilderness, forgotten by the world he had sacrificed his soul to serve. The transition to Gaul was a brutal shock to Pilate's aging body and fragile mind. He found himself living in a crude, drafty stone cabin, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out the sunlight. The constant, icy rains and the howling wind seemed to mock his isolation. Without servants, without companions, and without the shield of his authority, the walls of his mind began to crumble. The silence of the wilderness was not peaceful. Instead, it was filled with the deafening echoes of his past. The isolation drove him deep into a dark, psychological abyss. In the quiet hours of the night, when the fire died down to embers, the cabin would disappear, replaced by the blazing heat of the judgment seat in Jerusalem. He began to experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. He would see the angry crowd of Jerusalem standing just outside his window, their voices carrying on the winter wind, demanding the release of Barabbas. But worst of all was the quiet figure of the Galilean preacher, Jesus. Pilate would turn around in his small room and see the man standing in the corner, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding that cut through Pilate like a knife. The ghost of his decision haunted him every waking moment. The whispers in his head grew louder, reminding him that he had exchanged an innocent life for a career that had now ended in complete ruin. Driven by an obsessive remorse, Pilate sought a way to cleanse himself of the guilt. He began to spend his days wandering the rugged banks of the local rivers, his eyes fixed on the rushing water. He would kneel in the mud, his hands trembling as he plunged them into the freezing currents. Over and over he scrubbed his skin, using rough stones and sand until his hands were raw and bleeding. In his fractured mind, the water was never clean enough. He would look down at his wet palms and see them stained with a dark, phantom crimson that would not wash away. The cold mountain streams could not cleanse the stain of the decision he had made on that fateful Friday. He screamed at the water, begging it to wash the blood from his soul, but the rivers only reflected his own hollow, terrified face. As the winter wore on, the despair became absolute. Believing he was cursed by the heavens, Pilate made a dark, final decision. To escape this endless torment, he decided to take his own life. The cold steel of his remaining Roman dagger felt heavy in his trembling hand, a final, bitter reminder of the authority he had lost. In the dark silence of his isolated cabin in Gaul, Pontius Pilate stared into the dying embers. The shadows seemed to twist into the shapes of the angry crowd in Jerusalem, their phantom screams echoing in his ears. He looked down at his palms, raw and bleeding from his desperate attempts to wash away the invisible stain of guilt. The cold mountain streams had failed him, but perhaps the shedding of his own blood would finally bring the silence he craved. With a final, agonizing gasp, the former prefect of Judea plunged the blade into his chest. He collapsed onto the cold dirt floor, dying a lonely, broken man, far from the grand palaces of Rome. No servants wept, and no monuments were built to honor him. He was simply gone, a disgraced exile, swallowed by the wilderness. But the tragic end of his mortal life was only the beginning of a terrifying legend. According to ancient accounts, his body was retrieved and thrown into the muddy waters of the Tiber River in Rome. The authorities hoped the flowing waters would wash away his memory, but the earth itself recoiled. As soon as the corpse hit the water, the sky turned pitch black, swallowed by unnatural clouds. A violent storm erupted, unleashing fierce winds and lightning that struck marble temples. The Tiber began to boil and churn, forming massive whirlpools as if the river refused to hold the defiled body. Terrified citizens claimed they could hear the shrieks of evil spirits rising from the depths. Realizing the river rejected the man who had condemned the innocent Galilean, the Romans quickly dragged the body out of the water to save their city from destruction. Seeking a resting place that would accept the cursed remains, they transported the body far north and threw it into the fast-flowing Rhone River in Gaul. Yet, the supernatural fury followed the dead prefect. Once again, the peaceful river transformed into a raging torrent of destruction, flooding banks and destroying homes. Dark, ominous mists rolled off the water, carrying a suffocating chill. The locals, gripped by fear, demanded the body be removed from their lands immediately. Realizing that no river would ever accept the soul of Pontius Pilate, a group of travelers carried the remains even further, deep into the towering, snow-capped mountains of Switzerland. High in the alpine wilderness, beneath the shadow of Mount Pilatus, they found a small, isolated lake. The water was dark, stagnant, and surrounded by an eerie silence. They cast the body into the deep pool, believing this remote tomb would contain the curse. Yet, the legends tell a chilling story that persists to this day. The lake became a place of dread, haunted by the restless spirit of the governor. Every year, on the anniversary of the crucifixion of Jesus, the water is said to churn. Witnesses claimed the ghost of Pontius Pilate would rise from the dark depths, clothed in his red robes, sitting upon a spectral judgment seat. There, in the freezing air, the phantom would obsessively wash his hands, forever trying and failing to cleanse the guilt of his ultimate sin before sinking back into the dark abyss. Yet, while Western legends paint a picture of a cursed soul rejected by the earth, a completely different story emerged in the Eastern lands. In the traditions of the Coptic and Eastern Orthodox churches, the memory of Pontius Pilate took a much gentler, redemptive path. These accounts suggest that in his final years, deeply influenced by the faith of his wife, Claudia Procula, Pilate experienced a spiritual awakening. In the quiet loneliness of his exile, he looked back at the trial in Jerusalem with a broken heart full of genuine repentance. He wept bitter tears of sorrow, praying for forgiveness from the man he had sentenced to the cross. In these traditions, the mercy of the Galilean preacher reached all the way to the cold forests of Gaul, washing away the stains from Pilate's soul. Some stories even claim he died a Christian martyr, standing firm in his new faith. Whether remembered as a cursed wanderer, rejected by the waters of the earth, or as a repentant believer who found peace, the legacy of Pontius Pilate remains one of the most powerful stories in human history. He was a man who tried to walk a middle path, hoping a simple gesture of washing his hands would absolve him of all responsibility. But history did not allow him to remain neutral. By refusing to stand for what was right, he cemented his name in the eternal memory of humanity, remembered forever not for his Roman honor, but for the fatal moment of indecision that defined the course of the world.